go live if everyone feels comfortable. Okay.
Yep.
Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Ari DeWolf, and I have the pleasure of serving as interim director for Genspect USA. And I am joined by some very, very special guests tonight. I want to give them a chance to introduce themselves, but as you can imagine, we're talking about issues that are, I guess, amongst the most controversial in our society. But that is an opportunity for us to get through them and talk about them with nuance and thoughtfulness. And again, I couldn't have a better selection of individuals to do that with. And so I want to start off maybe with ladies first. Representative, if you'd be so kind as to tell us a little bit about your background and how on earth you got to the watchtower with us, proverbially, to be addressing these issues and trying to help us sort them in public life these days.
Thank you. Thank you, Ari. And it's just an honor to be here with the other panelists. And on behalf of Genspect, I am Shawn Thierry. I'm a state representative in the great state of Texas, from Houston, Texas, actually, House District 146. And I really came to this fight very unexpectedly. I would not have predicted that I would be a woman in the arena on this. But having served 4 terms in the Texas legislature, this past session, we were confronted with a very serious issue. And we were looking at what the correct policy is. And so we had a bill that said that we were wrestling as what is the appropriate age for a child to either have a sex-changing surgery, which in and of itself sounds like a weird thing. Why would a child be doing that? Or how young can children take puberty blocking drugs to stunt their growth through puberty so that they can be on the trajectory for sex changing procedures. And so the legislation said 18. I voted for it. I thought that was very reasonable. Thought it was consistent with all of the other areas of the age of consent. And immediately from that night on, a year and a half ago, my life changed. I began being attacked, online, everywhere I went. I got attacked politically, socially, and was threatened to be canceled. I did end up losing my bid for reelection over that issue. I'm still state rep, but my term will end in January of 2025. But I always tell people, don't feel sorry for me, because it meant a lot to me to do the right thing on behalf of the nation's children. And so while I lost my seat, I always ended and say I didn't lose my soul. And that's the most important thing to me.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. And I know that speech is available online. We'll try and link to it in this discussion because it is so powerful, and you were given complete attention, and that doesn't happen very often in these legislatures. And so I think it's really important for everyone to have a chance to listen to your words directly at that very historic moment. Professor Reilly, would you like to go next?
Sure, yeah. So, I mean, if we're doing a basic intro, I'm Will Reilly. I'm an associate professor of politics at Kentucky State University, which is a historically Black college located in the Kentucky State Capitol. I'm also the author of a number of books, Hate, Crime, Hoax, Taboo, The Things You Just Can't Talk About, and my newest one right behind me, plugged there, as a supporter of capitalism. And the way that I got involved with Genspect and with the gender question more broadly, I think one of the things I research is kind of the idea of the conflict between truth and what people are supposed to believe. And this is really prevalent in modern upper middle class America, as I think we all notice. But it's something that goes back well before that, to sort of mandatory religion that people research in political science and so on. And the gender ideology seemed to me to be kind of the apex example of this. Like, there are very obvious biological differences between men and women. Men cannot be women. Women have the ability to create life in their bodies. Men are 40% larger, 8 times as aggressive. I mean, this is a classic divide you see among most mammal predators. Like, we all know what this is. We all understand what this is. There's certain dysphoric conditions that we should be very sympathetic to that cause people to feel otherwise. But when society began not facilitating social politeness, but saying that there are some men that are literally actually women, which no native community or anything like that has ever done. And there are some women that are literally actually men. And as someone who works out at the gym and all this, you started seeing people like this entering the locker room. It became evident that this is something people were going to have to respond to, or there would be actual social consequences to it. The prisons right now are being integrated by sex, essentially. If you're a male rapist who feels that you have become a woman in your heart, due perhaps to jail onset gender dysphoria, you will go to the women's facility. And there have been multiple pregnancies caused by this, acts of serious violence, rape, stabbings. So, I mean, I think that was the thing that made me kind of respond to this and say, well, no, there needs to be a coherent social policy on how to deal with people that passionately believe things that aren't true. And the real exacerbator in terms of when I speak at a conference or something like that was the situation with kids. The representative just said that. But I mean, the argument is this almost never happens. I mean, as a social scientist, you pretty easily can find what a do no harm just did a great service by posting in the public arena. I mean, this data is available from hospitals and so on. There have been about 15,000 of these surgeries and courses of hormones just in the recent past. And that's objectively insane. I mean, the average quote unquote trans kid goes on within about 2 or 3 years, if that, to become just a gay person or someone with an interesting sense of style. That happens about 91% of the time. So I thought that it was important that people, not just from the political world, but from sort of the research community, come forward and say, like, no, we know what the reality is here. This is a real problem. And that's why I started discussing the issue.
Thank you very much. Mr. Coleman.
Yeah, so my name is Adam Coleman. I'm an IT guy turned author and writer. I write for multiple publications, Human Events, New York Post, Federalist, the list goes on. And I guess I got into this because, well, one, I started talking about, just being honest and talking about protecting children. But I was talking more so about protecting children through the family structure. And then obviously the topic of protecting children comes about when we deal with the gender ideology and if that's harming children or how it harms children, to be honest with you. So, from my standpoint, it's not about trans. It's about mutilating children. Is there ever a scenario where mutilating children is a good thing? No. For me, that's it. So, if some child is struggling with their identity, then that's something that they need to work on, but it doesn't mean that they need to cut themselves, to tear apart their body, to do things like that in order to affirm it, especially when we know, like he was saying before, many of them grow out of it. And it may be a social contagion. It may be just circumstantial. Maybe a phase. Maybe they're just trying to fit in. And the idea of doing something that's permanent, to harm them, whether it be surgery or taking so-called puberty blockers, then I don't think that's something that we should venture towards. The risk is too high when it comes to doing stuff like that. So that's why it's not my number one topic necessarily to talk about, but when it comes to protecting children, that's my number one concern.
And you bring up a really important point that I always like to stress, Mr. Coleman. We're not trying to go after one group, right? Even to protect another, children.
Mm-hmm.
I'm always so impressed by the individuals that are made up of this movement, that make up Genspect, that make up just this forum right here. Everyone is led with such compassion. Everyone is led with, again, such thoughtfulness. And if you really look at a lot of the prescriptions that we are proposing and the remedies we're proposing, it protects, quote unquote, trans people as much as it would protect anyone else, because we want to make sure there's no harm. We want to make sure there are no gimmicks. There's no coercion or others trying to game the system to take advantage of these people who will be lifelong medical patients if they go through this track. And so I wonder if those of us, again, who come from, quote unquote, minority groups or oppressed communities, do we have a certain level of moral authority when we talk? I'm a gay, half black, Jewish conservative. I've had to leverage my diversity, right? And I use that because I notice my white friends may not say something, or my Hispanic straight friends may not say something because they feel like, well, I can't get away with saying that, right? So do you all feel like you have to, I mean, if we just cut straight into it, you have to leverage your diversity sometimes to be able to make the case in this strange, new, enlightened era we live in, this postmodern era?
I was smiling at one of the comments, but yeah, I guess if we're just going sort of counterclockwise around the circle, I'll respond to that. I mean, I think that certainly being a quote unquote diverse person helps. It's a little harder to call you a Nazi if you are a black person or a Jewish person from a working class background, and you're saying, as I happen to be, and you're saying, well, I'm speaking about this not as a member of what you might assume to be the current ruling hierarchy, but just as someone who has myself experienced some discrimination and who finds this problematic. Yeah, I also find this kind of an idiotic way to look at things. So just bluntly, I mean, like looking around the panel, we all seem to be sort of upper middle class would be the term. Two of us are wearing the same polo shirt. I mean, which is something I joked about before the panel. The host is wearing a suit, albeit without tie. I mean, and obviously the three of us are greatly overshadowed by the fourth panelist. But so, I mean, in terms of actual oppression in my day-to-day life, as you know, I drive a European car to the college I teach at. Do I experience a lot of that? No. But if people want to talk in this kind of hierarchical fashion, saying things like, well, the only people that disagree with our position would be anti-black, anti-queer, ruling classers, it is useful for me to say, well, I'm black, and that's not an accurate description at all, and then make the point. Hopefully we can move past this style of communication, because as it stands right now, anyone could simply identify as gay or bisexual and outrank me. I mean, on that debate, or bring up anything, a personal experience, incarceration or something. I don't think that has anything to do with the value of your point, but unfortunately, a lot of people think it does right now.
Can I add in on that too? Gentlemen and everyone listening, I had a very unique experience with that. One would think that as a Black woman who attended two HBCUs, Howard University and Texas Southern University, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, the first Black woman to ever represent my district, that I would not have been called a Nazi. But I was by white radical progressives. They called me a Nazi only when I took this stance to protect children from child mutilation, to stop children from amputating healthy body parts. I was called I was called a Christian nationalist, and they may have called me a white one, even when they knew I'm not white. So they leverage sometimes race against Black Americans that don't fall lockstep in line with the ideology. It's almost as though your Blackness takes it takes a back seat. It erases suddenly. Whereas if we were talking about food insecurity, and I was 5 minutes earlier taking a stance to pass a policy to decrease, food scarcity in my district, they'd be like, right on, soul sister. That's what the white liberal would be telling me. But the moment I take a stance against the sexualization of children or the amputation of children, I, as a Black woman, lose my Black card, and it is open season at that moment to question everything about me at that moment, in terms of my race and my loyalty to my community. And so I think it's so important that we're talking about this tonight, because they'll do it in such a surreptitious way that it will cause other Black people who don't know anything about this to then say, well, they're calling her anti-Black, maybe she is. And I'm running around waving my hands going, wait, I went to Howard, I went to TSU, I'm just trying to save kids. But they know they'll dog whistle, if you will, is kind of what I'm saying. The dog whistling happens, and before you know it, none of us are Black people anymore.
Right. And perhaps even more importantly, we're humans, right? And we're all given reason and a rational ability to discern. And so I wanted you make sure that you're able to speak on this, Mr. Coleman, especially when it comes to the subject of language, because I know that's where you work best. So if there are any thoughts you want to make on what we've just discussed and where it intersects with language, and how they trap us using that mechanism, please go right ahead.
Well, I mean, they only trap us if we want to let them trap us. Like for me, if my skin color becomes some sort of advantage, it's not because I'm trying to make it an advantage, it's because that's their perception. Just like talking about race, anybody can talk about race. I'm not stopping someone who is not Black to talk about certain things that are going on. You deal with certain repercussions. You know, I've talked about race that is unpopular, and I deal with certain repercussions, even though I'm talking about the very race that I'm categorized as. So I think we have to be more fearless when it comes to how people perceive us, and allowing them to control when we speak. Because censorship isn't always them forcing you to stop talking. It's your self-censorship as well. So for me, these people don't scare me. And I think a lot of it is they play off of these different horror stories. Most people aren't state reps. You're a very public figure. And I think a lot of people are afraid of what that might feel like to be insulted, because most people aren't targeted, just even a little bit and insulted. We see people freak out when someone replies to them in a negative way on Twitter. They're not used to having that spotlight on them like we are. But because of that, they play on that. I think a lot of fear is used to keep regular people silent. And so they just don't say anything. So when it comes to their school board and they want to pass something and they don't say anything, or when their teacher tells their kid to do something that they know it's inappropriate, they don't say anything. So it just becomes a lot of self-censorship because they think that they're alone, or they're afraid that, well, if I say something, they'll do this. And what if they dox me? What if they put my address out there? And that's all just scare tactics. And you do it to one person, 20 people see it, those 20 people stay silent. That's how it always works. They just make an example of someone. But once you understand the game, it doesn't become nearly as scary. And I'll tell you, even though I'm a public figure, I don't get the same amount of animosity as regular people who do get caught up. And the reason being is because they know I'm not scared. I'm not worried about them. And they know that it won't work on me. If someone was to find my address, okay, that's not going to stop me. So I think that's the difference. I think they play off of that fear for a lot of regular people. For us, it doesn't work in the same way. And I think they know that.
I certainly don't want to stop anyone. If anyone else has something to add to this.
Let me unmute my mic here. Yeah, I think that what Adam just said actually is extremely important, which is that if you are in a reasonably stable social and financial position, you're obviously not scared of some of this stuff, you actually can talk pretty freely. I mean, so after maybe my first year on social media, I don't really get any threats or anything like that anymore. And I'm very immature. So I used to respond to people who would actually send actual threats with things like a picture of my gun collection and the message, "Don't do it, King. Suicide is a mortal sin." And then I kind of grew out of that. But when people realize that you're just sort of on the center, right? You have an independent business. You're not going to be moved. You're not going to be particularly frightened. It really kind of dries up. And I think there's a point there that goes back into almost the history of thought, which is kind of the infidel versus the heretic. So people are much, much angrier at people in their own coalition that deviate in some tiny way than they are at opponents who are honorable opponents. Yeah. That's exactly right. I mean, when the representative says, I supported 90% of this. I went to Howard, but I said, do we really need to be doing this to kids in the Black community? And people started going, or any community, people started going crazy. That's where it happens, because you are vulnerable. You're on that political side of the aisle. These are your friends. You can be shut down. If my friends are a multiracial group of gun and gym bros, there's really little impact that the fourth wave feminist community getting mad at me is going to, there's some friends there actually, but it is going to have. It's not going to change my life dramatically. Might be some tiny effect on dating or something. But the more stable you are in what you're saying and the more distance you are from some of the crazier people out there, this is probably true on the friend right as well, the more ability you have to speak freely. I think that's a very important point that was just made.
And I just want to, before we conclude on this segment, Ari and gents, I wanted to kind of say that when we talk about the use of language, I think it has to be said of how language is used to manipulate the audience to manipulate the world, but particularly where, this topic is on Black Americans. So when you call something, for example, even if you do speak out and someone says, well, why would you be against gender affirming care? You have to come really, really informed, because just the use of the word care, it sounds like something very lovely is happening. Like you're going to be taking away cocoa and marshmallows from kids, right? With a little blanket. And you go, wait a minute. No. Let me explain what we're talking about. We are talking about cutting off, giving girls as young as 14 and 15 double mastectomies who do not have cancer. We are talking about castrating Black males. Now, and this is the progressive wing of the party that talks about all the atrocities and the dark history of slavery. And now somehow you have, through the use of language, managed to convince people that this is a caring thing to do to Black boys, to sterilize them, cut off their testicles, give them Lupron, which will prevent them from developing as full men, even if they do choose to be gay later. So this use of language is very manipulative. And I would love to put it out there to our scholars. I think the only other time I've seen this happen in such a surreptitious, deceptive manner is like when you're really dealing with like a cult. They're very good at that. That's how you pull people in. For example, we've got gender affirming care. Now we call breastfeeding chest feeding, which is when a man does it and pretends that he has milk coming out. Mothers now are called birthing people. We've changed language there. So all of this use of language, I think, is really how we're influencing and manipulating Black America.
Thank you for saying that. Of course, sir. Absolutely.
So she brought up the term cult, and sometimes, cult gets overused, but in this case, it's accurate. The tactics of manipulation are cult-like tactics. Leveraging your social status, isolating your child. For example, if you have a child who's struggling with it and they have these cult members surrounding them, that's how they turn them against their parents. That's what happens with religious cults too. They say that no one will understand you except for us. And they'll poke holes in ways to make you start to have distrust in your parents. And so then as time goes on, you isolate yourself from them, and the only people that you have is the cult. And that type of behavior is actually happening. So it's beyond just the language of just twisting things around. It's in the behavior as well, and how they, especially for the most innocent and naive, children who are not prepared for this level of manipulation. I think that's what's even more insidious to me, is that they inflict it on kids the most. So it's one thing for some 40-year-old man who wants to, cut his stuff off and claim he's a woman, so he can wear a dress and feel like himself or herself, whatever. That's one thing. But it's another thing to manipulate a child and tell them falsehoods, and to not only tell them falsehoods, but to isolate them from people that love them unconditionally, to bring them over to a group of people who only claim to love them with conditions. Because once that child wakes up and wants to detransition, that's when the heretic response kind of comes in.
Yeah.
Yes.
Just a final note on this, at least for me, others may have more to say, but whenever you're debating in politics, and especially with the hard left, you should be aware of the language that's being used, because it almost all comes down to wordplay. Like, as a political scientist, probably 95% of systemic racism, some maybe residual in the South, but 95% of that's just social class, some due to past conflict. But I mean, it's really, really obvious when you start unpacking the variables that people are using, so on. I mean, and you see this all across the gender space as well. I mean, so for example, sex worker for star in hardcore porn. And I mean, you have to say, why do you oppose sex work? Well, because I don't really view that as a conventional job. You have to start unpacking every layer of what's being said. And I mean, the language that sort of erases women, and by the way, also men in this arena, is some of the craziest I've heard. If you were at a bar and you started referring to normal women as sort of bleeding people with front holes or something like that, your friends would shut you up. I mean, this would be tolerated almost nowhere except in this arena where you're able to present it as evidence of care. So these classic insults become positive terms. We're reclaiming them and so on. I think normal people on the center and right should do a lot less of tolerating that. Like, I would not want to be called the male equivalent of any of this. The final example of this that I can think of is eunuchs returning to the scene. I mean, this is this awful thing from the ancient days. If you lost a war, you were castrated. There's now an argument that this is a legitimate gender identity. So if men feel that they are not masculine enough to have testicles, they can now go to a doctor and get what's called an orchiectomy, which is where they literally, I don't want to be too graphic here, tie them off or take a knife and cut them off like a Byzantine emperor would, and you're now a eunuch. That is your gender. And I think it's perfectly appropriate to say, no, this is all just bizarre evil in many cases that you're disguising by using this medical language. That's very important. Like, sex work still is prostitution or abuse in most cases. You know, becoming a eunuch is just having your testicles cut off. Like, that's what that actually means. That's not really affirming anything.
A minor attracted person now
is a pedophile.
Is a pedophile. I was like, we already have a term for that. It's called pedophilia, a pedophile. But now they've decided to call it MAP. You know, how cute, a minor attracted person. It just means you're attracted to minors. So this is why I made the comment that it's some kind of secret society, but operating in plain sight and getting regular, ordinary people to think that they're bad people if they don't co-sign on it.
Yeah.
And what is this? Again, is it the fruits of postmodernism? Is it scientism? Is it just our even though this should be an age of the greatest human rights and democracy, certainly in science and healthcare, we have to defer to the new priest class, which would be our doctors in many ways in this secular age. Is it that we are just so caught up with those that have the alphabet behind their name, that have the expertise, that we're second guessing our own common sense? And so I'm putting that out there as one issue we can tackle, but putting it back into the context of our ethnic communities, our social community. Why do you think it is that it's taken so long for Black folks to be able to galvanize behind this issue? Is it because it still seems like it's a myth out there? Does it seem like it's a Republican talking point? Why is there a recalcitrance on this issue in our communities? So if any one of you want to take any of that, by all means, help us unpack.
I think the reason being is that this type of dogma is coming from one particular economic class. It's usually from upper middle class and above that are repeating this. The ones who get the most of this type of education within schools come from the top schools. The most indoctrinated colleges are the Ivy League schools. It's not a coincidence. I remember talking to a parent in person who was able to get their son into the top private school in the country. And they literally have classes on this, in preparation for when they go into Ivy League school. It's like that for a reason, and it's become religious for them. This is why, if you're putting it in the context of Black Americans, most Black Americans are not wealthy. They're not going to the top schools in the country, and they're not exposed to this particular thing. Most Black Americans are relatively middle class. They're regular people who go to work, come home, raise kids in normal neighborhoods. And so they're not necessarily exposed to this. And I think with the internet, I think drips and drabs of it are making it through to the most vulnerable children in each ethnic group. So yes, there are some Black kids who believe in this stuff, but when I see them and I see why they believe in it, they believe in it for themselves, but there's something that's underlying. Usually it's something that they experienced when they were younger. So for example, many of like the hardcore feminists who are basically misandrists, they were hurt. They were hurt by a man, and this ideology became a reason to hate men. and it said it wasn't just this man that hurt you or these two men who hurt you. It's all men. This is something inherent with them, and so they grab onto that, and that's what's insidious about this ideology. It never helps someone heal. It just makes them angry, and it always makes them an activist to fight some sort of battle with an entire group of people that they've already decided that are guilty. So when it comes to this gender ideology, I think it plays much of the same. I think there are a lot of kids, and especially if you want to talk about Black kids, coming from single parent homes, whether it's girls who are getting caught up and they're confused about their world. And yes, this ideology gives them some sort of purpose, gives them a friendship group. It gives them something. And I think that's the hole that, this ideology is able to seep into when it comes to these kids. There are a lot of kids, and it's not just Black kids. Once again, we have a national, not even a national, it's a Western issue. We have a Western issue of broken homes. And a lot of kids are extremely vulnerable to manipulation and ideology. And you multiply that with the internet and social media and these new ideas, and they don't have a solid foundation at home to combat these ideas. And then you have parents who aren't even aware that they exist.
Yeah, I
That's
mean,
so perfectly put. Thank you. Please go right ahead, sir.
Okay, yeah. Any of us could have jumped in there, I think. But yeah, so I mean, I think there are a lot of comments there that are interesting. The first thing that I agree with Adam pretty strongly on is that group level thought is bad. So, I mean, he's describing extremely hardcore feminists who become essentially man-haters. And we've all seen this happen as a result of, say, physical abuse. There are guys that do the same thing in reverse. I mean, my girlfriend cheated on me. There was an abortion that we didn't agree on. There's some major issue in my relationship. And so women are the problem. And if you just log on to Twitter, you'll see plenty of this from both men and women, men taking L's and this kind of thing. I don't really think probably 85% of normal heterosexual relationships, I think that's a fair estimate, are non-abusive and mutually reasonably happy. So saying men do this or something like that doesn't make any sense. You could take that into the arena of race. Black people currently have a higher crime rate. Whites have a higher rate of the use of extreme drugs, probably from our perspective. That doesn't mean that if I have a Caucasian friend, they're an opiate addict. That's the distinction between the individual and the group level. And this focus on the group level is generally negative. So, and by the way, one comment here, your remark about hardcore feminists is misandrous, is derogatory to women. Not really. Not every person who identifies as a feminist hates men. But I mean, there are online accounts with names like I Hate Men with 500,000 people following them. So again, there are many people that select a group they dislike. I obviously welcome any input on anything I say. But there obviously are people that take individual experiences and say, well, the problem is blacks or something like that. And I think that's almost never true. But to return to the question of why there's less of this in the Black community, less focus on gender identity, I think that one very simple answer would be that most kids that are going through these transitions, and I think we mostly care about the kids, are Caucasian. So, I mean, when people like Christina Buttons look at who transitions, who actually begins affecting or damaging their body, it really demographically is sort of upper middle class, white, mostly females, interestingly enough, among kids. Men come in later for different reasons, but that are choosing to do this. A very small percentage of African-American working class kids are doing this. And I think in a one-line attempted explanation there, we've placed a value on victimization and uniqueness in our society. I think that would be hard to deny. So if you are just a well-adjusted upper middle class white girl or boy from Cleveland, abuse might play a role and so on. But one thing about being bisexual or something like that is you can say, well, I'm different too. Someone mentioned in the comments section that 98% of quote unquote trans women never remove their penis. So the goal is to sort of say, well, this is a unique thing about me while still chasing women. And I think it's hard to avoid that, the pursuit of the different today.
Ari, may I? I wanted to add in, because I saw this on the ground level a lot in my own district, because it's a diverse district. I've got one part of the district that was primarily white progressives, upper class, upper middle, all the way to upper. And then I have another, I'll say it in thirds, another part of the district that was what we would call the Black bourgeois, the bougie part of town. It's called Third Ward. It's where the upper echelon Black people aspire to live and go when they do well. And then I had the area that was the lower socioeconomic stratus, right? It's no secret. I represent an area called Sunnyside. They have the highest rates of maternal mortality, highest crime rate in the country. And so I spent a lot of time, obviously, in Sunnyside because the need was so great. And that's where I would do my food drives and do my back to school supply giveaways. And on the ground level there, across the board, Black people thought this was wrong. Okay. They had not been socialized and, should I say, intellectualized so much about this that they had to question whether a child should amputate a healthy body part or whether a boy should be castrated or a girl should be stopped from menstruating before she's ever had a chance to do it. They didn't need to read a book about that. They know at their core gut level that that is abuse. And I'll tell you why, because when I pivoted back over to the other side of town, they did not feel the need to assimilate. And so I'm going to say some things that are very provocative here because we're having the conversation. It was almost like the more educated we become, and I say that because we're all educated Black people here, so I'm not insulting anybody, not us for sure, but it's almost like the more educated we become, there's this need, this aspirational need to emulate what we perceive to be white culture at times. And so the reason I think it is important that we talk about this, whether Black kids are doing it at the level of white kids, is that just like everything else, it's going to happen. We always pick up, we bring up the rear. And then typically when we do, then we go full throttle and then we take something and put it on 100 and then it becomes our thing. So before you know it, my prediction is, unless we fail at this, if we don't fail at this fight, we'll be okay. But if we fail, that this will be something that in 30 years, there won't be really white kids doing this anymore. And it will be Black children that are solely transgender and that are mutilating their body parts. And it will be a form of the population control that it is. Because it would have started at that level where we started watching something. It was trendy for a while in the white community, right? And like you said, a form of social contagion, and then they'll move on to something else and it'll trickle down into our communities at the level that I'm talking about. And it'll start to happen. Right now, Black parents don't really even know. A lot of Black parents don't know, but when I took it to my friends that also went to Howard, when they asked me, Shawn, what is everybody mad at you about suddenly? And I told them, I found it interesting that those that were in social clubs and that go to cocktail parties where they're more likely to run into progressive Democrats, they seem to try to find a justification for it so that they could continue, as you said, to fit in with the progressive white liberal elites. They started to try to say, well, if the parents want it, I guess it's okay. And when I would say things like, well, I can't go put a tattoo on my daughter's face who's 12. That's illegal in Texas. I just can't go tat her up because she wants one. I can't cut off her healthy foot. Why can I cut off her breast? And then they kind of were like, well, you know what, girl, it is crazy, but, I don't want to make anybody mad. But when I go back down to Sunnyside, they're just straight up, hell no, that's horrible. We're not for that.
Yeah, if I can add one thing, because she brought it up. The only Black people that I consistently see that believe this stuff are usually bougie college grads. So
Yeah, that.
But
No,
not
I think
us. But not us for some reason, right? Why not us? Because we're that, but we're not.
Well, I think part of being heterodox is just being independently thinking enough to say. So this is actually an interesting point. Like in any society, there are a certain number of people that can look at the prevailing social ideology and say that's bullshit. One thing that I would recommend talking to the audience briefly, like there's a facility of logic that human beings have. It's the reason that you can serve on a jury and listen to professional prosecutors and defense attorneys and decide what you think, and on average provide a more reliable verdict than a judge. I mean, that's something literature has found for years. There's a reason that you can put together your thoughts and write an op-ed and put it in a major newspaper and reach 1 million people. That ability that people have to see what reality is incredibly valuable. And to the parents out there, I would encourage you to use that. When you see someone saying, well, this 6'1" boy is a girl because he secretly has a girl's mind. Women have different kinder minds, don't you understand? I mean, you can ask yourself whether that makes sense or whether it doesn't. And the reality, I think, is that it pretty obviously doesn't. It's just nonsense. And so you can reject it like you would reject any other nonsense. Very briefly, the comment when you guys are saying this is bougie people, this is, you go to a working class neighborhood, there's none of this. You go to the reunion, probably for Howard, certainly for my University of Illinois, you'll see tons of people. There's a seminar on queering the curriculum at the old alma mater. I mean, I don't know whether this is going to reach back into the Black community. That was extremely well argued, actually. But right now, the biggest predictor of this is being upper middle class. Like, there was a great paper that came out recently that didn't just look at gender ideology. It looked at things like campus protests. And it found that the biggest predictor of a lot of riots on campus was that the students were rich. Like, they had a lot of money and time. So if you went to Southern Illinois University or most of the HBCUs, Florida A&M, great smart kids, but they're there to get out as police detectives or lawyers or whatever. They didn't have time for that. If you go to Oberlin, Bowdoin, all these bespoke schools with 500 students, that's where you saw people beating up cops, riots that hospitalized 3 or 4 people. I found that fascinating. People were talking about the protest experience, the sexual play experience, the gender experience. I don't think the average working class kid is on campus for the protest experience.
Well, I think it's because when you're daft of real problems, you make your own. And I think if you're a child who comes from a wealthy area where you didn't have to worry about where you're going to live, like I did when I was a kid, or, you know, if you're going to eat, you don't have those real problems to worry about. So I think it's part of human nature to find a struggle. And so for them, they have to attach themselves to some sort of struggle. And then they have to make sure that, well, everybody must know that I'm part of this struggle. And they just want to be a part of something. It reminds me of the movie, I don't know if you heard of it, called PCU back in the 90s.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's exactly what we're seeing. We're seeing these college kids. There's one group of kids who would switch from one cause to another cause every couple of weeks. So one day it was save the rainforest, one day it was free Mandela, and then someone had to say Mandela's been freed already. Like, like they just didn't know. They just didn't have a struggle. And they're just,
isn't that okay? I'm sorry. Isn't that what they're kind of supposed to be doing? The horrible part about this industry and ideology, it is the only time I've ever seen that the rest of the logical thinking world is buying into it. For example, when I was in high school, I'll date myself, I went to a mostly white high school. And a lot of the girls back then were anorexic. That was like, it became social contagion. Not that that's not a real form of body dysphoria, but it almost just started catching on. I mean, it did start catching on. Then they became bulimic. You know, first they were just, you know, it was all tied together. And then just suddenly it kind of went away. Nobody talked about it. Nobody was looking in the mirror anymore saying they were fat when they were 95 pounds. But with that, you didn't find the parents saying, oh, yes, you really are fat. Let me go get my 90-pound-year-old daughter liposuction. Let me go get my son gastric bypass surgery. Let me go get my child on massive diet pills like Ventermine, knowing it's going to give them a heart attack. That's what's happening with transgenderism with kids. And so we know that it is natural in a phase of development to question everything. You know, and the more intellectual you are, the more you're going to do that. What I'm hoping that we can stop, and by having these conversations, is stop those of us who are the adults in the room, right? To tell them that it's not real. You're not fat when you weigh 84 pounds. And you're not a girl when you have a penis, no more than you are a vacuum cleaner. You're just not. That's it.
So I have an answer as to why that's the case. The difference is back in the 90s when the girl was starving herself and she was anorexic or bulimic, is that she could be brought to a doctor and they would confirm that your daughter's bulimic or anorexic. What's happening now is that the expert class has been poisoned. They've been captured too. And so Chloe Cole, her situation is a perfect example. When she started going down this path, her parents brought her to the doctor, and the doctor said, well, do you want a, what's the phrase? Do you want a dead girl or an alive boy? It's that type of manipulation. So the experts and their parents went along with it because they were manipulated by the expert to move along with it and harm their child. So even if you're a parent who sees what's going on, but a lot of people have what I would call expertise inferiority complex, right? Where the person with the degree must be smarter than I. So if they're saying this, then I must go ahead and do it rather than imply some common sense. Have you ever seen anything like this? Does this make sense that we should cut it off? Maybe there's a second or third opinion that we need to get when it comes to this particular thing. So I think there's a lot of insecurity when it comes to that. It's one thing to have that back in the day where the expert class wasn't basically captured the way that it is, or even worse, where they're corrupted and they're trying to make money off of it. And they're like, yeah, I'm right here to help you cut them off, So I think
that's my concern.
That's the biggest difference.
With those of us that are in the working class, and if we're just getting access to certain services and goods, this is where you can be at a dangerous crossroads, right? Because finally you can achieve access and some decent quality. Why wouldn't you trust? Now, why would you go in and cause any consternation, right? Once you can finally have access to decent medical services. And I wonder, maybe Professor, you can speak to this, and I want you all to take a look and see what folks are saying in the chat, if there's anything you want to speak to, because I know we can go over a little bit of time. But this is supposed to be the transhumanist era, no? Is that not what academe had slated for us some time ago? And so I don't know what that means entirely. I have my own thoughts, but it seems like the elite or those that are in control of this narrative and agenda, they certainly had foreseen this coming, and there's been some preparation for it, again, in the language. And so I wonder if anyone has any thoughts on what it means now to be in this transhumanist age, and if there are any thoughts that you see in the chat and you'd want to respond to, because we know that there are some aspects to what we're seeing that's happening in the state, right? You see someone like Richard. I will not say his last name out of just protection for his story, but he's out there publicly. He was in California. He was not a minor, but suffering from schizophrenia and suffering from a family that could not take care of him. If anything, they were predatory. The state gets him. And what happens to him? How quickly do they say, well, you're suffering from gender dysphoria, and they mutilate him and they leave him back on the streets. And so, and that's one of our boys, if we talk about it in those terms, right? He was a Nigerian immigrant. And so I wonder, what does this mean, again, to be in a transhumanist society? Is that what that looks like, right? And again, if there's any comments you see out there from our friends on the live stream that you'd want to address, just as we're starting to close up shop here, I want to make sure everybody gets in any closing comments.
I'll say, so transhumanism, first of all, I think transhumanism started out as a goofy idea in science fiction. I mean, that was Richard Feynman and all those people, and it was the idea that someday we'll be more than humans. I think to the extent that, so there are a couple levels. One, do we want to do that? You guys might correct me, but I think it was the European Union that proposed something called the Not of God's Creation Act, where they said you can't attempt to make truly sapient robots. You can't use what's called recombinant DNA tech to change human bodies. For example, you can't put tiger DNA in human soldiers. You wouldn't grow fur or anything, but you'd have faster reflexes. You could probably see in the dark to a certain extent. Do you want to do that? If we decide to, I mean, so like Elon Musk's Neuralink is what in sci-fi books is called a tutorial implant in the brain. There's no reason you couldn't meld your brain with a computer and in practice seem smarter, be able to Google in your head. That's probably 50 years away. I don't really have a problem with some of that, but I also wouldn't have a problem with a law really slowing down the pace of it either. I think the difference between transhumanism and transgenderism is that transhumanism is real. So, for example, if I spend 10 years training in the martial arts and the most advanced meditative techniques, and I get an injection of cat DNA in my arm, like I actually am stronger and faster than someone who's not an adept. If I decide that I am a woman and I cut off my penis, and I hate to put it that way, but I start wearing dresses and I start entering women's spaces, I am not a woman. So at very least, those are things that people should be left to deal with on their own. Autogynephilia hasn't really been discussed much here, but as an adult, but that there's a difference between that and going through some medical process so that you can see better. I probably am pro transhumanism, but we're going to see how society votes on that one.
Thank you for taking that one on. Anyone else want to address transhumanism?
Or add one little part about we touched on it
Yes.
with respect to biological males and imposing their way and will in women's spaces, such as sports and prisons. We've got to just get back to, is something fair? That's how you usually know if something's right. It's so unfair what's happening. And the fact that people are being desensitized to it, we hear these words like, let's normalize this and let's normalize that. Well, can we normalize like not cheating, not abusing? For those feminists, it's just such an odd position that they're taking now, that they're turning a blind eye to a man, a biological male who may have been convicted in the first place for sexual assault, who went to prison for sexual assault, who then now says, I identify as a woman, even though I raped a woman, and now I want to be transferred to a women's prison. And he's allowed to do that. We will cater to that. Certain governments, certain states will cater to that. And then that same man can go back into prison and has raped again a woman. And so, it's not right. Anywhere you were to explain that, it's not right. And so I spent a lot of time when I was in the ledge, trying to talk about this with my other fellow policymakers and colleagues. And I can tell you all of the academia, when it all comes down to voting, everybody put all that to the side because they knew it was wrong. And at the end of the day, they just told me, Shawn, we get it. You can calm down. You don't have to intellectualize it. We know it's wrong, but hold your nose. Because there is a power structure at play now. And we heard about it. There's an industry behind it. There's money behind it. There's influence behind it. And so I think if we just can try to get people to care, we live in a society where there's such a lack of empathy. I predict, and I'll say we heard it here first on this webinar with all of us, that the day a 6'2" white biological male takes a medal or a trophy from a prominent Black female athlete, that will be the end of it, because Black America is going to lose their minds. We will then start a movement. We know how to do a movement. Right now, we just haven't seen it. If there was no Simone Biles, there'd be a problem, or if somebody came after her. Unfortunately, we're seeing this happen to white females, and they are being robbed. But for some reason, they're just now starting to boycott everybody, but it's not the same as a Black boycott. And so I put that out there, that is it because, this is being allowed to kind of bring it back home because it's not as pervasive and it hasn't happened to a face that we can identify with.
Hopefully. I hope that is correct. I'm not sure about that, actually. There's a website called something like hecheated.com, but it's all of the transgender victories in women's sports. And again, it's like the number of surgeries. It's one of those things that never happens, but it's happened, I think, 787 times. Like at the state level, a lot of these girls' elite track meets are being won mostly by males, white and Black. I don't know if mostly is the word. Some of the sprint races are. But there are plenty of pictures of Black girls and athletic looking Viking blonde white girls and all these other people just sort of staring as a guy runs past them. I mean, the women's swimming natty, which had a pretty diverse group of swimmers for that sport. I mean, the number one finisher was Will Thomas from Penn, Leah Thomas. I hope that's correct. I hope that as you see, not just women, but Black women, popular women, so on. You know, the old LeBron James and the WNBA analogy, like losing out, there will be more anger. No, I mean, the women's swimming
I don't want
championship.
it to happen to anyone, but you know my point. I just meant like a famous, a household name, like when we had Angel Reese. You know, if Iowa happened to have a team on there who had taken the trophy from those Black girls at LSU when the entire Black world, Black America was watching them in the locker room, I think there would have been a little bit more hell to pay.
A little bit more because it's basketball. Yeah, fair enough. Winning point. It's a revenue sport. But I mean, we'll see. I think and hope that's true. Again, we've already seen the national track and swimming events, though, where like Riley Gaines got so mad about this, she started a career as a speaker. Where the one guy entered 3 races and finished first, 4th, and 8th in the country. So people. You're probably right that we're over the precipice, but people have been extraordinarily tolerant of this for a very long time. Sports may be the one zone that gets people realizing this is crazy. I think prison has even more potential to do that because you can't refute the logic. There is just available to everyone. Like, so you want to send a rapist into a women's prison? Well, yeah, she's a woman. I don't. Nobody actually believes that. So we'll see how they respond to that dissonance. Would you call it that duality?
Right. And I hope you're right, Professor. I guess maybe I sound like the Marxist here tonight, but I'm just concerned that population just does not get enough attention to begin with. And so, but I hope you're right there because it does make common sense. Will it rally people? I don't know. I certainly hope it does. You know, the least among us, right? In many ways. Yeah, go ahead.
To the comments, actually, Kay Danowski, I think, disagreed with one of my points earlier, but this is correct. At the 2024 Olympics, 2 men won gold medals in women's boxing. Yeah, I forgot that. One of them was white, right? Like, we've seen this at the highest levels. This was the Iman Khalif, where the biological man was like roaring and knocking women out, beat up an Italian fighter, a Nigerian fighter. So this has been going on with very diverse panels. At some point, there does have to be a breaking point, I would say.
Yeah. No doubt. Mr. Coleman, did you want to add anything as we begin closing up for the night?
Man, I don't know. I think
you got free range, sir.
I think in general, as much as we're talking about the problems, I'm rather optimistic. There are a lot of people who a couple of years ago wouldn't have said anything, and not just about this, but about various massive changes that happened in our culture, especially since 2020, who said, I've had enough. And they said something just like myself. And that makes me optimistic about having some sort of change. I've seen people like Jennifer Say, who sacrificed to tell the truth. And here she is as a fighter for women having safe spaces within sports and being able to compete fairly. So there are a lot of people, maybe I say a lot, but there are a number of people who are saying something. And then I'm seeing a shift where people aren't as scared to say something. Because I think it's that fear part. Everybody's afraid of being called a racist, a bigot, a transphobe, homophobe, all these different names. And after a while, it just goes in deaf ears. And then you start coming to the truth of it. This is true. You're a man, you're a woman. There is no in between. And so we have to stay with the truth and not be scared of these people, because when you become scared, that's how they gain power. They leverage your fear over losing your job, your fear over losing your social circle, all of these different things. When in the reality is probably the people at your job agree with you. Probably your social circle agrees with you. And that's the secret. And so we just have to remind each other that the fear is greater than the possibility, or the fear is greater than the possibility of you experiencing that horror story that you read about on the internet. And the more of us that stand up and say something, the more brave we become. So if you're that parent who goes to that student, when you go and complain in front of the school board, you you might think you're alone, and you stand up, you say something, and you start seeing there's 10 other people clapping with you. You're not alone when it comes to this stuff. A lot of people with a lot of common sense are starting to push back. So I think people should remain hopeful. And I do think that part of this is going to be like the bulimia and anorexia trend of the past, especially Wilfred was talking about how this is mostly young girls.
Mhm.
I think that's part of the trend, and I think it will start to wean off coming from there. I think we're seeing pushback from certain states, so it's not just this is it, this is the culture, and everybody's accepting it. There is pushback, and it is gradually moving back in the direction of common sense.
And perhaps just in case anyone else wants to add some final lines, I'll say a few things just so you can get your thoughts together. Firstly, I want to thank Genspect. I want to thank all of you for your time. Everyone who's listening right now, who'll be listening in the future, please get a hold of us if you have ideas about what other issues we should be covering, how we should be covering them, what voices to include. We're a very bottom-up organization, and we're nonpartisan. We're just interested in having honest, thoughtful, nuanced conversations around these issues, because whether we like it or not, this is what our families are dealing with. This is what our society is dealing with. So many of us have left our plow, you could say, and we've gone on to become citizen legislators in many respects. And we've taken a new sense of citizenship to delve successfully in this issue area. So I just want to thank all of you that make up this community, because I've seen the change that happens. We are the ones we've been waiting for, and the unity and the community that comes together, and the transformation in self by actually being the heroes and by being bold, it's the greatest thing I've ever seen. So I just want to again thank all of you for doing what that little voice inside of you is telling you to do. It's making a difference. So as far as our guest's inner voice, anything else you want to share for the good of the order and for the good of the people tonight?
I wanted to thank you all. It was so refreshing. I do feel a little more encouraged to be on the panel with Black men who are taking a strong stand on this issue. I have felt quite alone for a while. And I do think you all are the key. I think your voices resonate in a different way. And I think that the more Black males start to speak about this and put their foot down and say, you're not going to castrate a little boy. It's not going to happen. I won't allow it, not on my watch. You're not going to sterilize our girls. We're going to love them and help them be the best versions of themselves. We're going to treat them with care and respect. I think that will make a difference. I cry about it a lot, you all. It's such a serious thing because the kids came to my office. I met detransitioners that literally came in my office and put their head on my shoulder and told me the deep regret that they have and how it's irreversible. And just looking in the chat, I would encourage everyone, let's not be naive. No, it's not easy. Sometimes you can. I lost my job. I was censored. I will say I wasn't silenced. And I'm willing to put it all on the line for our kids. And so thank you all so much for caring. Moderate people by nature are quieter. They're not the picketers. They're not the activists, but that's going to have to change because the kind of society that we're living in now, there is an agenda to adult children. And so I want to stop the adulting of children on all levels. Thank you guys so much.
Sounds good.
Professor, anything else?
Well, I was actually going to leave it there. I think Shawn said a somewhat better version of what I was going to say, actually. But yeah, in one sentence, I do think men need to step up and get involved with this issue. Men and women are equals, but do speak differently, have traditionally had different social roles. And this has been almost entirely a women's issue for whatever reason. The group most likely to support gender ideology actually is liberal women in the United States. It's important to just openly confront that and say that. Many quote unquote liberal feminists view this as one of their major issues when I do polling. On the other hand, the TERFs, the people that have been opposing this, speaking out, holding large events, are all also female. I mean, quickly put, we hear a lot about masculinity there don't seem to be too many situations where it might be more needed than people trying to send male sex offenders into the jailhouse or the locker room with women or children that you know. So I would like to see the guys, not just in the Black community, come forward and talk about this as boldly as other people, often female, have. So yeah, that'd be my take. And men, no, come on, like women, they're a little more verbally intelligent, a little nicer. I think guys know pretty well that there's a difference between a man and a woman. And the reluctance to say that is just almost totally fear-based, can't be bothered, don't want to have the argument. It is time for that to stop.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Very good.
And I guess,
Sir,
the
close
last
us
thing
up.
I'll say is, the government has its purpose, but the most important government is the family. If we're going to save our kids, it has to start at home. And so the first thing we have to do is educate ourselves, be aware. The second thing we have to do is talk to our kids about this, because it does exist. So just like how back in the day we talk about stranger danger and prepare them, so if some strange person pulls up, they know what to do, they know what it looks like. Well, we have to warn our kids about this. And that's exactly what I do with my son years ago. I warned him about things like this. I said, if you see anything strange happen in your school, you tell me about it, which he did. When they started asking kids, they brought in some consulting company to ask kids what they identify as and what's their sexuality in his high school. So, he let me know. And that's what open communication with our kids and warning them about the dangers of the world in an age-appropriate way is incredibly important. But we can't turn a blind eye and say, well, that's just them. Because trust and believe, we're talking about, the upper class. Well, guess what? The upper class, they start these consulting firms and they go into your neighborhood. They teach in your schools, and it's slowly making its way to the rest of us.
Well, not for long. We got the best community here. Again, it is a privilege and a pleasure. And I thank you all. And I look forward to our next many discussions ahead. Have a great night.
Godspeed. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.